So now I'm going to introduce, so next up we got a great panel. They're mainly be talking about GACs, groundwater availability certifications, the roles that counties and districts play in that. You know, I can't say enough about the people on this panel. Of course, Leah is one of my favorite people in the whole world. One of my county commissioners, and I'm not saying this because he's just a county commissioner, he's a great guy, he's a good friend of mine. Has nothing to do with the fact that he appoints 2 of my board members, nothing to do with that at all. Mitchell, if you don't know Mitchell, sometimes he's quiet. He's not the most social guy, but I think very highly of Mitchell. Very, very intelligent guy. We kind of have come up, and he started as general manager not too long after I took over at Upper Trinity. And then John, I believe you're also on the panel, and I don't know you as well, but I'm getting to know you. So he's very sharp also. So I think we're gonna have a really good panel. This is something, a topic that's really important to our district, and I hope that you can all take something away from it. And that's all I got. Thank you guys. Y'all have a great day and safe travels home.
Good morning, and thank you for having us here today. As Doug said, my name is Leah Martinson, and I want to just echo his comments about the great work and the huge effort that Adam, Anik, and Stephanie put into making this event a success. I know from having lived it how much work, how much stress it is, and they've just knocked it out of the park yet again. So I just wanted to share congratulations to you all. We have a great panel this morning. As Doug mentioned, we have Jacob Holt. He is a Parker County Commissioner. John Ellis, a hydrogeologist with Interra, previously spent a number of years with the USGS. And Mitchell Sodek, who is the general manager at the Central Texas Groundwater Conservation District in Burnett County. I'm just gonna provide a little bit of context for our conversation. Texas is big, 171 million acres of land. 93% of that is private, and 83% of it is private rural lands currently. We also know, and we've heard so many times, that Texas is growing at an astounding rate. Population projections show that our current 31 million people are going to be to over 51 million people by 2070, and that's what this chart shows. And the map on the, I don't know if it's my left or right, but the map, the darker blue shows those counties that are really seeing a high degree of population growth. A lot of those people are moving into more rural areas on the outside of cities. I'm gonna, oh, where's my clicker? There we go. This graphic shows some of the counties' growth. 10 of the 20 fastest growing counties in the United States are located in Texas. Those are listed on this chart. And we have counties that have seen growth of over 15% in just a 3-year period. And if you look at housing unit increases in Texas, many counties have seen in that period a 33 to 57% increase in housing units. They're happening all over the state. And if you look at it through a lens of water supply, state water plan figures predict shortfalls in supplies to meet the demands that our state is going to have. This chart here is showing in blue the demand and in red the supplies. And of course, that's what the state water plan is intended to do, is to help close that gap. But even based on our current state water plan, even if every strategy contained in the state water plan is implemented, there would be a shortfall of 2.5 million acre feet by 2070. And if none of those are implemented, that shortfall would be 6.5 or 6.9 million acre feet by 2070. I spent about 15 minutes on Google News and grabbed a number of headlines about the collision of growth and water supply in Texas. As you see here, headlines like thirsty new subdivisions have made the Texas groundwater crisis plain to see. Texas growth on a collision course with new reality of drought. And these articles, they're literally from every corner of the state. It's making news, it's on everyone's mind, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So with that, I want to turn to my panelists. And just to kind of set the stage, I was hoping I could get each of you to share a little bit about your region, the growth that you're seeing. And I was hoping to start with you, Mitchell.
Sure, thanks, Leah. I don't know who came up with the title for our panel here, but it's great and it's very fitting for a tagline that I've used before. And so from Angus to Augustine, it lines up with what we're seeing in our district. A few months ago, we were having a meeting in the city of Burnet, and Charlie Flatten, he was coming up to Burnet, and he asked me, he said, "Hey, can we go eat barbecue afterwards?" And I said, "Well, Charlie, there's no good barbecue in Burnet." And there hasn't been for a long time, and it's kind of crazy because this is Central Texas, hill country. You would think there's got to be good barbecue here, but there's not. And so we went on to our meeting, and it was a panel like this. We were talking about growth in the hill country, and I was, touting my tagline that as little as 25 years ago, Burnet County had more cows than it did people. And now zoom forward to today, and the opposite is true. Now we're growing people instead of cattle, and people just don't taste as good. So therein lies the barbecue problem, and it's really the crux of what we're seeing here. We have ranches that had maybe 2 windmills on it that were raising a couple hundred head of cattle, and suddenly we've got 300 homes with 300 individual wells on that same tract of land. And that's really the growth that we're seeing in our area, really in the entire hill country as a whole.
So one statistic I didn't mention, because I had spent a minute looking up for the same reason, based on our title, the current size of the Texas herd is actually the smallest it's been since 1961. Partially and primarily, I think, due to drought and culling of the herd. But yes, you can't cull people like you can the herd when water's not there. So Jacob, let's turn to you. Why don't we talk a little bit about Parker County and what you're seeing up there?
Sure. So Parker County, for those of you who don't know, is just to the west of Fort Worth, and we are the problem children. I'm not going to call us the bad guys, but we're the bad guys. We have drilled more private water wells, groundwater wells, than any other county in the state, and it's not even close. Personally, I think it's just lax leadership from our local groundwater conservation district. I can promise you that's not it at all. It is not that one bit. Doug has been absolutely fantastic, and Doug has been screaming from the rooftops. We're a formerly rural county, but we have the Trinity and the Biloxi very shallow, and we're right next to Fort Worth and DFW. We've got good access kind of to both via some loops around. And so when COVID hit, we saw massive, massive growth rates. I think from 2020 to 2025, we are number 8 or number 9 in the nation when you look at that period of time from a growth rate perspective, and most of that due to Tier 2 legislation, because cities can no longer annex in property involuntarily. Most of that growth is via 2-acre tracts out in the county, which is a tremendous, tremendous burden on our infrastructure, our roads, our county government, all of those things. But even worse, it's a giant burden on maybe the most important infrastructure, and that's our water. We have a town in our area that Doug used to call his residence before he moved up and moved out, and that town's called Springtown. And Springtown ain't got no springs anymore. And there's a reason for that. It was named Springtown because it had springs, and now there are no springs. And so this is something that is extremely important to me, because if I'm going to have an area where my kids and my grandkids can live and prosper and be safe, you have to have water to do that. So,
thanks for that. And John, you work for a number of groundwater conservation districts that are facing growth issues. Maybe you could just share a little bit about the landscape in those districts.
Sure thing. So I work, when it comes to working with groundwater availability certificates, I work primarily with Prairie Lands GCD and Northern Trinity GCD. So that's Johnson, Hill, Ellis counties, and Somerville County in Prairie Lands, and then Tarrant County for Northern Trinity. And I mean, over the last 4 years, I mean, the population's increased in both of those GCDs by over 50,000 people. So you have in the Prairie Lands area, you have almost 500,000 people in those counties now. And there's a tremendous growth in water needs, especially with computers and data centers moving in. So there's really, it's tremendous growth in those areas. I mean, if you look at Tarrant County, again, population increase of what, 3% or about 50,000 people, which makes it the third largest county in Texas behind only Harris and Dallas counties.
Thanks for that. So now I want to turn and talk about some of the issues that this growth is creating. We've already touched on some of those, but I want to dive in a little bit deeper. And it was mentioned that a lot of this growth is dependent on domestic exempt wells. Those wells that are exempt from any permitting requirements of the local groundwater conservation district. Chapter 36 of the Water Code creates that exemption for lots that are 10 acres or larger and allows for the production of 25,000 gallons per day from those wells. And a proliferation of these obviously can cause issues. John, could you speak just a little bit to some of the issues that are created by having an excess number of exempt wells?
Sure. So I would say with that, I mean, if you look at the rate at each of these individual wells, that just works out to about 17.3 gallons per minute. I mean, the rate is not large on these wells, but as the other panelists have mentioned, you have a lot of them. There are a whole lot of these wells, and they're everywhere. And, over time, I mean, what can happen is, of course, that pumping from each of those individual wells does create a little bit of a regional depression there, or localized to sometimes a regional depression in the groundwater levels. I mean, that just decreases your saturated thickness there in your aquifer. So it means less water's flowing into your well screen, which means your well yield can be reduced. You may have to set that pump deeper. That's of course not a cheap proposition. Water quality can be degraded due to vertical leakage of water from poor quality formations. And so these things individually are not necessarily just the cause of only just domestic well pumping, but if you have enough wells in any location, regardless of what they are, you can have these kind of impacts.
Thank you for that. And Jacob, you touched on this, but I'm hoping you could talk a little bit more about kind of some of the issues that you've seen, particularly from recent legislation that has made it more difficult for there to be involuntary annexations and the ability for areas to de-annex from cities, and how that has contributed to some of the problems in your area.
Yeah, so involuntary annexation actually started at Zion Hill Community Center, which is a small little white kind of country church in my precinct 2 of Parker County, and from there spread to be what is now a national movement. And personally, I think it's a fantastic idea. I'm not much of a city guy, but I do believe very heavily in private property rights. So I love the ability for folks who live in the country, they live out in the unincorporated areas, to say, no, we don't want to be brought in to be part of the city. We chose to be out here. However, like anything in a complex situation, there's pros and cons. One of the cons, I suppose, of not having the ability to annex land in is there's only a limited amount of land inside the city, and most of that is almost all developed. And so there's not a lot of places to put apartments and things like that. So when you have a very attractive area like Parker County that's close in geographic proximity to Fort Worth and Dallas, especially with COVID and telecommuting and some things like that that drive the ability for folks to want to live further away, you have a spot where we've got a lot of land that's outside of cities, and now people move there, they cut it up into 2-acre tracts, they put a well in, and oh my gosh, they don't have a water bill, so they can have green St. Augustine grass when it's summer and it's 105 in August. And it's a recipe for disaster, so yeah.
Thank you for that. Mitchell, something obviously that comes up when you have this growth is conflict between different user types, people who'd been there previously, the people moving in, new industries, existing industries. Could you speak to a little bit of the concerns and issues that have come up in Burnett County in that regard?
Absolutely. There's quite a few conflicts that arise. And when you have a lot of growth, a lot of ancillary growth comes with it. And so you need support from industrial mining for aggregate, for concrete and asphalt. And then we've got commercial use as well to support a lot of that residential. And it's kind of been a challenge when, let's say, we've got right now a brand new aggregate mine coming in. And people understand the need for aggregate, and they understand the need for it, but it's coming right next door to them where they're having their private wells potentially affected by what the quarry would be pumping groundwater to wash the aggregate. And it's hard to explain that, there is no prioritization of water. So these people believe that their drinking water should be the highest priority, but as we've learned through this conference, groundwater is a private property. So the quarry who owns this property, they have every right to produce that groundwater and use it, within subject of the district rules. But it's difficult to explain that, yeah, your drinking water is important, but it's not placed at a higher priority as industrial water or water used for commercial use. And so you have these challenges, these competing interests that come to play, and it creates quite a bit of conflict at times.
Have you seen similar conflicts in Parker County, Jacob?
Sure. So Parker County, if you know anything about it, if you're in the cutting horse world, Parker County is known as the cutting horse capital of the world. And if any of you are rodeo fans, I'm sure you know the name Bob Tallman. Bob is the great rodeo announcer, and he actually lives in my precinct and has given me an earful more than once. So he's a great guy. With that rural heritage, we have these areas where they have these huge, beautiful ranches that there's not a lot of water production, and we're very limited from a county perspective to have the ability to say, hey, someone's trying to put in a subdivision there, and the water is such that they can't really, all flush their toilets at the same time or whatever that might be. So there's this very kind of struggle between maintaining our Western heritage while also acknowledging that private property rights, if someone wants to sell their land and develop their land, they ought to have the right to do that, except and unless, in my opinion, at least, I'm not speaking for the entire Commissioner's Court, your ability to enjoy your land should be limited to some degree, or to the degree that it diminishes the ability of others to enjoy their land. That's my personal opinion on water usage.
Thanks. John, something I think about quite a bit is communities getting caught off guard by the growth, not being prepared for it. I think of it also in working with so many districts, a district thinking, oh, no one's coming for our water, and not being ready for that big application that hits their desk. What can districts do to prepare for growth to make sure that that does not become the case?
Sure. So I think for that, it's a combination of management actions and data collection and analysis. You want to have sufficient information on your aquifer system, on what's below your feet, to really understand what that unit that everybody's producing from. Can it take all that additional withdrawal? Is it sufficient? Are the water supply sufficient? So really, what you're looking at there is you need to have a robust monitoring plan to understand what's happening below your feet, looking at those water levels in each aquifer unit, looking at that production across the district. What kind of trends are you seeing in the aquifer system, and kind of assessing that aquifer health, and then using modeling tools to assess the impact of additional pumping on the existing wells that you have. If you have a lot of surface water resources, as Jacob mentioned, those springs that were once flowing, why did they stop flowing? Having a look at that, really looking at what's happening to the aquifer health, and also looking at the management actions of this too. You can update the district rules based on the data trends you see. The exempt wells, those don't require a permit, but they can require registration. Absolutely require registration. You can ensure spacing and state well construction standards are met. That growth can trigger another look at the well spacing, at your management plan. So these are all things you can look at, tools that are available under the existing regulations here in Texas.
Thanks. Now I want to turn our conversation to one of the key tools that's available when it comes to addressing water supply and residential growth. And that is the groundwater availability certification. Most basically, for those of you who don't know, a groundwater availability certification is a prerequisite to obtaining either county or municipal approval for a subdivision plat. Those had previously been optional, but back in 2023, under state law, a bill was passed to make those mandatory. So a groundwater availability certification is a statement from a licensed professional engineer or geoscientist confirming that sufficient groundwater resources are available for the proposed subdivision when groundwater is the proposed primary source of water. So now that is a mandatory part of subdivision platting in Texas, with the goal of ensuring that water supply is there for new developments. The form and content of that certification is set forth by TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. John, could you go into a little bit more depth on the kind of giving us an overview on the process of a groundwater availability certification?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'll just go over the general process, and Jacob, I'll rely on you a little bit for the upstream parts of it that, where they happen prior to the arrival of all the information from the groundwater to the Groundwater Conservation District. So, the initial steps here, again, this is all governed under Title 30, Chapter 230, subparts 4 through 11. So the initial steps are a developer submits a preliminary subdivision plat to the County Commissioner's Court for an unincorporated area, or a city council or a planning commission for inside a municipal boundary area. So under Texas Local Government Code, if the subdivision intends to supply water from a groundwater under that tract of land, then the plat must be accompanied by a groundwater availability certificate, i.e. the GACs that we're talking about here. So the county clerk's office or the planning department, it checks to see whether that plat triggers this requirement, sometimes in consultation with the Groundwater Conservation District. So you get into the next phase of this, kind of the technical phase of the GACs. So the developer will hire a Texas licensed PE, professional engineer, or PG, professional geologist, and they prepare the technical groundwater availability analysis, and they sign the TCEQ form, that form 20982. So that involves a few items. They have to calculate the 30-year demand for that plat, which is just the population per capita use multiplied by the number of lots. And then they also have to do an aquifer characterization as well. So that's under 230.7. They have to look at the stratigraphy, the lithology, the geology, the hydraulic properties, the recharge, and the water quality. And then they also have to obtain site-specific groundwater data, and that's under 230.8. And that's where a lot of the time is spent when it comes to looking at these GACs, not only in creating producing the forms, but also on the review side at the GCD level. So that site-specific groundwater data, that means an aquifer test in the same aquifer submitted with the GAC, or an existing test if it's within, I believe, a quarter mile of that location. So they're looking at the water level decline at the well, the tract boundary, the 30-year period, plus geophysical lithologic logs. So they have to gather all of this data. And then they also have to do a water quality review, which is in 230.9. So those are the major required elements of a GAC. So that's the technical phase on the submitter side. And then after this point, kind of the GCD phase of things, during that process, the developer will register those test wells with the GCD, and at that point, the Groundwater Conservation District knows, hey, we probably have a GAC coming our way when they get those test well applications. So the GAC review then is performed once the GAC is submitted to the district, and again, in accordance with these Section 230 requirements. So on the district side and then on the consultant side, we're evaluating the integrity of the data on the GAC. That is the number one priority for us, is this a solid GAC? We're testing the assumptions listed on the GAC. We are looking at the aquifer characterization, the site-specific data, and that's kind of the area we will focus on. So for example, we're looking to see if the hydraulic properties are obtained from late time well test data. It's assumption for a lot of the methods we use. We're looking at the validity of the drawdown evaluation submitted with the GAC, particularly the spacing of the wells, the pumping well and the monitoring well. So we're looking at all of these items. And I'm also going to note that a GAC it's not a permit, right? This is just all it means is it does not authorize groundwater pumping. It only certifies the availability for planning purposes, and that sometimes gets confused. But that's overall, that's the basic process. And Jacob, if there's any details you want to fill in, feel free.
When we get the information back, when the developer and their engineer or geoscientist sends it over, we've actually got an interlocal agreement with the Upper Trinity, because they're a lot smarter than we are, and they know how to read that stuff. And so we work with the Upper Trinity to interpret those results into practical information, and that allows us to maybe come back with recommendations on water storage or something like that. But it also really gives the county the ability to have some degree of certainty that on a very simple level, hey, there's water there, and we believe, based on somewhat normal conditions, there should be water there for a while. I think it's a 30-year window. And so ours is much more on the review and receipt of the information side with the help of the Upper Trinity.
Well, and you touched on something important, Jacob, and that is the collaboration with a local district and the county in the review process of this, to the extent that there is a groundwater district present, and to the extent that the county is open to looking for that expert advice from the local groundwater conservation district. I think oftentimes they're best positioned to be that advisor to the county. Mitchell, could you speak to the relationship between Central Texas GCD, the role you play, and collaborating with the county?
Yeah, we are the groundwater experts, so I think we need to be very proactive in these GACs and the reviews, and we have a great relationship with the county staff, the development services and their staff, and also the commissioner's court. And I think that's a key piece to doing these in the best and most efficient manner. I think that it's important to be as a groundwater district, to be a part of the process from the very beginning. And at times, some of these developers, they don't even go to the county first. They come to the groundwater district first, knowing that they've got to prove this groundwater is going to be available. And so we communicate back and forth with the county staff, and we just make sure that the process and the plan to do these studies is going to be sound. The requirements for a GAC are really quite minimal, one pumping well, one observation well. So we have these pre-meetings, and we develop with the consultant for the developer, how they're going to go about this study, how many wells they're going to drill. We try to do all that up front so that we don't just get delivered a report at the end and say, hey, review this, and we found X, Y, and Z was wrong or needed to be modified. We're going to be a part of the process along the way, so that the study is valuable to what we're trying to do and what the county's trying to do.
And was Burnett County requiring groundwater availability certifications before 2023?
Yeah, I approached the county commissioner's court in 2019 to adopt the groundwater availability requirements, and so we've been doing it since that time.
Thank you for that. So, John, as an independent consultant, you have a slightly different model with how you engage with the district and the county. Could you speak to how that relationship is set up?
Sure. So we're primarily looking over, like I mentioned earlier, just the technical accuracy of the documents that were submitted. So we're primarily on that technical side, and we're kind of downstream of everything. Once the test well has been submitted, once the GAC has finally been submitted, then we get that from the district. And with that, I mean, we're looking at the major pieces. Again, we're looking at what's the technical accuracy of this GAC? Does it make sense? Did they give us a puzzle to decipher? You laugh. We get plenty of those. Has that person that stamped it, have they done one of these before? And that's usually pretty clear. If they haven't, are they familiar with this process? I mean, are they trying to use different methods, different methodologies, not using the GAM, coming up with their own methods? Is the well that they submitted, is it actually in the aquifer that it should be? You laugh. That's not always the case. Or they tell us it's in the Trinity aquifer. That's great, but which unit within the Trinity? So that we're looking over these sorts of things to make sure that, again, the technical accuracy is there to protect the water supplies.
Thanks. And something we talked about when we had gotten together to prepare for this panel, in talking about relying on the staff of the local groundwater conservation district versus an outside consultant, was some of the kind of political dynamics that might come into play. Jacob, could you speak to that a little bit?
So Parker County has some history with groundwater regulation, and I'm not going to get into all the nitty gritty, but back in 2018 and 19, I think Doug probably has some, I don't think he'd call it fun, but I think they're probably exciting stories to share. Moving on now, though, to 2023, we actually adopted the requirement before the legislation made us. I think we adopted the requirement in March 1st of 2023, if I recall correctly. We we have to engage with the Upper Trinity because they are the local experts. But at the same time, that does create a little bit of a push-pull dynamic where if the Upper Trinity is coming back and saying, hey, there's really not enough water there, but the person who's wanting to do it has some, local authority or clout or whatever, I think, let's just be adults here and let's recognize that what's real, that can make the situation a little bit more tricky. And so I do think that sometimes having a third party to blame, like John with Intera, would probably help Doug quite a bit, maybe sleep a little bit better at night. And sometimes I think it would help us as commissioners have an outsider to blame. And I think that's a valuable option when you need it.
Thank you for that. So, John, you had talked a little bit about some of the technical review that you're involved in. I understand that Intera has developed a checklist kind of to streamline and improve that review process. Could you talk a little bit about some of those tools you've developed to use in this process?
Sure. So again, we're just going through the generally all the Section 230 requirements. We essentially just put them together into a little bit of a flow chart, and we're looking to just running through these essentially one item by the next. Again, the importance being there is, did this person that submitted, did they just check a box, or is this actually done correctly? So that's most of our end of it, again, is just looking at the technical accuracy of it and just ensuring that the Groundwater Conservation District has all the important data they need. And it's not just, did they do it or not? Did they do it right?
And Mitchell, you alluded to this earlier in talking with the developer and talking about their going forth with the pump test. You work, I think, pretty closely with them in terms of designing that pump test to try to make sure that it is done correctly and is giving the best information possible. Could you talk a little bit about that and how you've tried to make sure that that is done in an effective way?
Yeah, and I'll say, the caveat is that the area that we're in, and really all the hill country, it's a limited resource. So we're not talking about aquifers that have a large amount of water. So the availability is a real question for almost every one of these projects. And when I was saying earlier, we try to be proactive from the very beginning, and that starts before there's any application whatsoever, designing how this study is going to go, and laying out exactly where the wells are going to be drilled, looking at the local geology. Everything is site-specific, and no one study is going to be exactly the same in our area because of the ever-changing hydrogeology. And so we try to be a part of the process. We try to be helpful, actually, to the consultant as well, and we are on site when they're performing their pump test. If it happens to be that there's some neighboring wells on the adjacent property and we find value in monitoring those during a pump test, the district will go out and equip those wells. We're getting additional information and additional data. And we've gone as far as performed geophysical logs, which is a requirement of the studies. We've done that for free as the district is gaining that information, and we have those tools available at our needs. From the process, from the district perspective, we're gaining a tremendous amount of valuable data. And since 2019, I think we've done 38 GACs in our single county district. And of those, there's probably upwards of 300 pump tests that were performed. And so there's a tremendous amount of valuable data that was collected. We want to make sure that that data was collected in the right manner and that the interpretations were correct, because that then goes into our groundwater availability models and everything else that we're doing. And so we wanted to make sure that we're a part of that process as well.
You answered my next question. I was going to ask you about that data and how valuable it can be to the district, and making sure that it's collected in a way that you guys can utilize it and rely on it. It really can be a gold mine.
Absolutely.
So, John, I understand that you have developed some models that you utilize in evaluating the water availability for prairie lands in Northern Trinity. Could you talk about those models?
Yes. So, and I'm just going to note first that just to piggyback on that previous answer, yes, we do use that district supplied data when we perform, create and calibrate these large scale groundwater models, these GAMs. So that data that is obtained from these pump tests, it is very valuable because in some areas that's all you have. You have no other data when it comes to trying to determine the hydraulic properties of the aquifer system. But we do develop groundwater availability models, and of course we have those in all the major and soon-to-be minor aquifers here in the state of Texas. But all that data does get used and incorporated, and it's very important at the district level to have that data, not only to use for modeling purposes, but just in general purposes if you're just looking at the empirical data. So all this does revolve around the data and the accuracy of the data.
The models. You have some models that you've developed to evaluate those impacts. Could you just speak specifically to the models that you've developed and how you've
Yes.
put those
So
out?
we typically use one-dimensional models to evaluate the local scale impacts when we're evaluating these groundwater availability certificates. We use software called TTIM. You can use any number of software that you would like. That's 3D modeling software. You can use ModFlow. There's a number of codes to do this, but we use particularly that software. These are used just to look at to analyze the drawdown between the pumping well, the nearest wells, the track line, whatever it may be, because there's differing requirements based on the district. But those models, again, are what we use is publicly available, so anybody can actually use that. It's not a black box, and we come up with those results just to, again, inform the districts of here's your impacts based on what we analyzed. You have the impacts from the GAC, and then we will actually check those requirements. And if the GAC was submitted with something that is different than what was used in, say, that groundwater availability model, then we will actually run it both ways with the GAM properties and with what they submitted, again, to provide that check to say, here's how they did it, here's how we did it. You can have a look at both ways.
Great, thank you. So something in the TCEQ rules allows for counties to require additional information. Much of the language is set up that the requirements are minimum requirements. Has Parker County taken the step of requiring additional information as part of groundwater availability certifications?
I think so, to some degree. Doug's nodding, so I think the answer is yes. If y'all can't tell, I rely on Doug a lot. His staff is fantastic, and he's great. We, in Precinct 2, we have started to ask that the model be not based off of static or current usage, but instead try to use some degree of modeling that shows future growth patterns. And so just getting involvement from maybe it's school districts, maybe it's realtors, whoever it is, there's plenty of data out there that projects where growth is going to be, and then applying that type of growth to current developments that are going in so that you can see, hey, you might be putting in, a subdivision in an open field right now, but all the projections say that those adjacent open fields won't be open fields in the future. Can we model that as well? Because we don't want to just have something where just one person gets all the water. We want to understand what it looks like for everyone in that area going forward.
And yesterday in one of the breakout sessions, there was actually a presentation by a consultant that works for Central Texas GCD about a tool, from my understanding, that basically does exactly what Jacob was just describing in terms of trying to evaluate some of those compound impacts of potential development. And is that something that, Mitchell, you guys have developed in the context of these groundwater availability certifications and considering future growth and development?
Yes, and that was Nick Lamke who was given that presentation yesterday afternoon. And there's a section in the requirements for assumptions and uncertainties, and so we really rely on that heavily to say if we've already got this number of platted developments already approved, and maybe not have drilled wells yet, but we know that they've been approved, as the consultant needs to make that assumption that those will be fully built out, and we need to consider those when we're talking about availability. And so we've gone through this scenario, and part of that presentation yesterday showed this, where we've got an area that has enough already approved plats on the ground that we think that there is no more water available. And it's come to the point where new applications were being applied for a new subdivision in that area. And before we even looked at what that subdivision was doing, we didn't even look at what their pumping was going to do, we could already determine that it was going to fail. And because of that, you know, there's these assumptions that go into it that may or may not hold true, but we think that it's the conservative way to look at it, that there's going to be enough, you know, wells in the ground in the future that there will not be water to support that new project.
And that's really a great segue into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is some of the implementation considerations and really what happens when you have a groundwater availability certification study come in, it's reviewed, and the conclusion of the district or the consultant and that is recommended to the county is that, hey, the water isn't there. What happens then? How has Central Texas and Burnett County handled that, Mitchell?
In a variety of ways. You know, one of the things that is unclear to me, and this is a bit of a challenge, is the process does not spell out when a study will fail. It's simply they're certifying whether there's sufficient quantity and quality of water, but it doesn't say, well, when is there not sufficient quantity and quality? So that decision is kind of left up to the individual consultant that's doing that, or the reviewer, in this case, the groundwater district and their consultants. And so we've developed our own thresholds for what's going to fail, and they are site specific, but you know, this is an availability question. And so do we think that there needs to be some level of water left in the aquifer, or are we going to drain it all the way down to the last drop? That's not practical. So we've developed these different thresholds to look at for when we think that ultimately it will not pass the certification of availability. And then what do you do once it fails? Well, that's the really challenging part. It's not a groundwater district rule. It's the county commissioner's court rule. So they're the ones approving the plat. It's unfortunately up to commissioners to deny that plat if the supporting science and the supporting data shows that there's not availability there.
And building off of that, Jacob, in Parker County, have you dealt with denying subdivision plats based on groundwater availability or potentially imposing additional conditions, for example, requiring greater well depths or requiring spacing beyond what a district requires in their rules?
Doug, I don't appreciate how much you started laughing when she asked that question. We've had some interesting ones, and we've had some 4-1 votes in Commissioner's Court on whether or not a plat should be approved in my precinct. Thank you very much. I was the one, just for the record. What we came to was, speaking specifically to what Mitchell was getting at, is it's not a multiple choice test. It's not a math equation in the sense of there's a discrete answer. It's like, do we have enough? I don't know. 2 reasonable people can disagree. We are in a PGMA in Parker County. So if I'm remembering the section of the PGMA rules correctly, I think it's 35011. Doug, did I get that right? Yes. So 35011 of PGMA says, or of the Texas Water Code says, that we can require a water system for a new subdivision basically at our own discretion because we are in a PGMA. So what we've done is we've put language into our subdivision rules that states that upon recommendation from the Upper Trinity, we can require that subdivision to have a central water system, which will go a long way towards ameliorating the issues of watering your lawn all day. All of a sudden now there's a cost attached to it. Doug now can permit and monitor how much water is used in that subdivision. Those are some of the things that we're trying to do because it's not a black and white answer sometimes.
Yep. And just for those of you who don't know all the acronyms yet, a PGMA is a Priority Groundwater Management Area. Those are areas designated by TCEQ that are determined to be experiencing or expected to experience within 50 years critical groundwater problems, including shortages of groundwater. And those counties have some additional authorities to manage and require things associated with groundwater availability. John, could you speak to, in Prairie Lands in Northern Trinity, any experiences with essentially failing groundwater availability certifications and how that's implemented?
So for that, generally where we have issues is when you're looking at that GAC in terms of the well spacing and the drawdown requirements there that are issued there at the district level. And it's a fine line sometimes, because you look at it, some of the drawdown you get at the nearest well, the nearest track, it's very close to the district rule. Do you deny it? Do you approve it? Well, you think about it, okay, well, maybe it's just a tiny bit off here, so we approve this one. But what if you keep doing that with all of them? So it's kind of a case-by-case basis in terms of what you do with these, whether or not you approve them.
And have you had experiences of groundwater availability certifications not being approved by the county?
So we have recommended that they not be approved to the Groundwater Conservation District. There's one or two right now that there will probably be a decision on at some point soon, and we're kind of waiting on those answers right now.
How about you, Mitchell?
Yes, but they usually get modified. So the initial proposal for X number of lots usually has to then balloon, or I guess the lot size balloons, so that there is a decrease in the number of lots, which means a decrease in the number of wells, and increasing the spacing between wells. So those are what we see most often. Is it's not just a simple yes or no. It's, well, it didn't pass with this many, but we can modify, maybe make a smaller development than what the developer really had his eyes set on.
Initially, yep. So with that, we're running short on time, but I do want to speak about a couple of pieces of legislation that have affected the groundwater availability certifications, created some problems for some parts of the state. At the same time that these certifications became mandatory, there were some changes to counties' authority to require subdivision plats for developments that have 10 acres or more lots and are reliant only on private roads. Those no longer need to be approved by the county. And I think, Mitchell, in your area, have you seen an impact as a result of that change?
Yeah, so let me just say that, and from 2019 up until that law became effective, we had 38 groundwater availability certifications come through. Since that time, we've had one. So what that means is every developer has gone to this exempt model, and in some cases, they failed a previous groundwater availability requirement study. We proved that the best available science showed that there was not going to be water for those homes in 30 years. So they then went to an exempt status of subdivision, still created the subdivision on 10+ acre tracts, knowing that there was not going to be water available.
And, you know, I mean, I think about that from the perspective of those buyers who don't know what they're getting into. How, or, you know, what, and this is for all of you, do you think can be done to help communicate to the public some of the risks that might be associated with purchasing lots reliant on exempt wells that the water might not be there? Are there actions that you're taking, efforts to get the word out? Start with you, Mitchell.
I mean, it's buyer beware, really. The risk falls on the potential buyer, but the groundwater district does try to make all of that data available. Unfortunately, when you're in the buying process, you're flooded with all this paperwork. You're not reading everything. You don't know what the conditions are. And even on a place that has passed a groundwater study, it may have certain caveats that says, well, you must drill your well to the deepest portion of the aquifer. Those things aren't often conveyed to the buyer. And so we do our best to try to do that at our district level, but there's a gap there. There's going to be some missing people, some missing information that's not brought to those potential buyers, unfortunately.
And Jacob, how about in Parker County in terms of trying to kind of get the word out and make information available in terms of potential risks? What all are you doing in that regard?
So we we have a number of very invested citizens that are very interested in this. We were exploring a collaboration with Texas Runs on Water, but I think they've kind of pivoted to some bigger picture stuff. And so there's some things we're doing on a local level that's as simple as putting out information on Facebook and just having a lot of conversations with people. Parker County is interesting because it's almost to 200,000 people, and yet it's still very small town feel in a lot of ways. So word of mouth can travel pretty quickly. We do see a significant amount of concern from the public that I don't think we saw 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, about, hey, what are we doing about water? Are we going to run out of water? Or so forth and so on. So I think any degree of communication from the local leaders to that is usually very well met.
Another issue that had come up during this legislative session that kind of didn't have an answer was there's an exception to the groundwater availability certification requirement if there's credible evidence of water availability and the water is coming from certain aquifers. John, could you speak to, we don't have a lot of guidance. Counties don't have a definition of what constitute credible evidence. As someone advising those folks, how would you help guide toward a determination of what is credible evidence of availability to support potentially waiving that requirement?
I would say with that, you just have to go back and look at the existing data you have. Is what they're submitting, is it lining up with what you already see? I mean, does it make sense there? It's kind of a case-by-case determination. It's hard to give one general overarching answer, but I would say with that, use the data you already have and weigh it against what you're seeing in the application.
Thanks. So we are running out of time, but I do want to give an opportunity to just talk a little bit more about some of the other kind of tools out there for addressing growth. Mitchell, what else is Central Texas doing in terms of, things like spacing, lot size requirements, management zones, drought contingency plans to try to, address growth, get the word out, manage the water to stretch it further?
And yes, we do all of those, all of the above, and we've primarily been going towards this model of management zones where we're identifying specific hydrogeologic areas that share similar aquifer properties, and then we're inviting stakeholders to be a part of that process. And so this is twofold. It's a highly educational process, so we're allowing those people to really learn what the district can do, what we cannot do, and what the available options are for managing groundwater within that area. And then those same stakeholders will help us, and we put them to work developing specific rules for what would happen within those management zones. And so we look at minimum tract sizes, we look at the well spacing, the production limitations on permits, and we're doing that in combination with these stakeholders so that, we're getting their input. We're not just saying, here's the rules, you got to live by it. They're a part of the process, and I think it works well for everybody. And a lot of those people are coming up with really great ideas, and so we're moving a lot more into that direction, and it's been very beneficial for us.
That's great to hear. Jacob, one thing that we had talked about in preparing for this call was discussions in your area about potentially changing minimum lot sizes as a way to help ameliorate some of the impacts to water supplies. Could you speak to Parker County's experience with that, kind of where you are in the process, some of the challenges, and how you're getting the community on board?
So that was something that was looked at in 2018 to 2019. There was very strong pushback from the community, but that was also pre-COVID and pre our growth explosion, as I call it. We're looking back into that again, I think with a bit stronger of a marketing effort when it comes out so that it isn't labeled as a one-size-fits-all, and instead doing some type of matrix model where suppose someone wants to institute rules that it's only going to be xeriscape or something like that, and then based off of the data of that location, letting all of those parameters work together to form a recommended acreage per lot. And that's something that we're trying to do. Our big problem in Parker County is something like 72% of the water usage on these private groundwater wells is for irrigation and landscaping. And when I say irrigation, I'm not talking about hay, I'm talking about St. Augustine or Bermuda. And so anything we can do to lessen that, we're actually also kind of seeing if the state legislature has any appetite at all on some type of property tax relief, because I personally like the carrot, not the stick. But if someone is willing to either voluntarily meter their own well and submit reports to the Upper Trinity, and or use some type of low water usage decoration, xeriscape, whatever you want to call it, can we find some type of property tax relief for those folks? Kind of kill two birds with one stone.
So I was about to turn to our concluding thoughts, and my prompt for that is, if there was one change that you would like to see to help counties and GCDs better address an over-reliance on groundwater and address new growth. I feel like you almost answered that with your last question. You did, but I want to give you a chance to either expand on that or give another one.
Yeah, it's tough because Chapter 232 of the Local Government Code requires, it doesn't say that they can or cannot. It says Commissioners Court must approve new subdivisions as long as they meet a certain number of parameters, and those parameters are very easy. In that sense, I liken us more to a DMV, where you can't go into the DMV and have them deny your driver's license renewal because there's too much traffic on the road. You would obviously protest that. We can't deny a new subdivision unless there's extremely specific set of circumstances. And so I'd like to see there be an exploration of a little bit more nuance there, although I am a very strong private property rights guy. And then the other thing, like I got to, was if we can find a way to tie property tax relief to water conservation, I think a lot of Texans would be very, very happy with that.
John, same question?
That's most of the same thing I was going to answer. That was a very complete answer. I would just say the other piece to that is just ensuring the information piece is out there, that when people are buying a house in a subdivision, do you realize if you have enough water or not? Be able to understand that information when you're making that decision. It's a very important decision, and empowering the counties and the GCDs to be able to, when needed, say no.
Mitchell?
Yeah, as a groundwater district that's stuck in between two pigma areas, and we are not within a pigma, it's really unfortunate that our county and our county commissioner's court doesn't have the same availability of rules and availability to look at water deeper if you're in a pigma area. And so allowing counties that aren't in a pigma to have similar authority would be great, or allowing the groundwater district to have some authority on these individually owned private wells in a collective sense. That would be really helpful in managing this style of growth, because otherwise we're getting ran over by it.
Thank you for that. So I think, Adam, are we out of time, or do we have time for? Okay. All right. We have permission for one question. Anyone out there have a question they'd like to pose? Sir?
They're a public utility.
I can repeat the question. He asked about like water supply corporations that operate within a CCN. What happens if they run out of water for their customers? What options are available? Any of you have any bright ideas to answer that one?
I don't have any good ideas, but we've had that happen in our district, and it's really bad because then the people are drilling their own private wells, and so sometimes you're having double dipping occurring where there's this public water system that has wells, and then now these individual small lots are drilling wells, and maybe they have septic tanks as well. It can be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a couple of examples of that, to answer your question, where a utility provider, and it's not as though all of a sudden you just turn the faucet on and gosh, there's no water at all. It's that there's a decrease in the water pressure and the availability. And what we've seen is they limit the number of new houses that are allowed to be built in that area that can tie into their system. The utility district will start to implement limitations on water usage, how often you can water your yard, things like that. They'll act a lot more like a city in that sense, where they put some heavy caps on that, and then all of a sudden a lot of people get really mad and they call me for some reason.
So the utility's not forced to go find more water somewhere else, or?
there's no legal obligation, to my knowledge, on that aspect of their obligation. But if someone else can come in a different area that utility covers and say, hey, you can't provide, like your CCN covers this, but you can't provide water to there, but we can. I think there's something like a 18-month process to get that transferred over, but that's an Austin deal. I try to stay out of Austin.
There were conversations about that issue this last legislative session.
30 years, that might be happening all the time.
Yep. Wonderful. Well, let's give a round of applause to this panel. Appreciate them being here today.